Okay, so this is a theory screencast. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Claude Levi-Strauss's binary opposites theory. This is a narrative theory. To remind you, narrative theories relate to the storyline or story structure of a media text. Now, what is binary opposites theory? It's very simple to describe, really. Levi Strauss argued that narratives basically all comprise of two binary opposites. Binary being, for those who know about computers, one and zero, as in complete opposites. So these are two opposing forces, and the struggle between these two opposing forces is the backbone of the narrative or story. Essentially, any story you look at will probably, well, no, will pretty much certainly have an example of it if you look hard enough. So I've put a few examples here. The first one I was going to talk about is Star Wars. Even looking at the poster, it is quite clear that this is going to be a good versus evil narrative. And there are your binary opposites, good and evil being polarized opposites. Even in fact, in the poster, they've dressed Luke Skywalker all in white, which has connotations of angelic nature and goodness. And then at the background, you've got Darth Vader, who's clearly dressed in black and his identity is hidden, all the things that have connotations of evil. And narratives can be that straightforward and that simple and that obvious. And looking for those clues can be very, very simple. You do have narratives that are slightly less obvious. So I've used Gravity here, which was an Oscar winner for special effects, but has kind of fallen into the wayside. But I think it was a significant film. Gravity involves Sandra Bullock's character trying to survive a meteor strike of the International Space Station. For the large part of this film, she is completely alone. She has lost contact with Earth. All of the other people on the International Space Station are either killed instantly or in some characters' cases are killed fairly early on in the narrative. So it almost feels like at points there is no binary opposite for her if it was to be looked at by the layman. But actually there is. The driving force behind the narrative is Sandra Bullock's character going to survive. And what she's fighting against is effectively is the forces of nature, of space itself. So you could argue that actually the narrative for Gravity, the binary opposites are man versus nature. In the sense that she is using all of her ability and her smarts. She is a scientist, and she's portrayed as very, very intelligent. And the technology left over from humanity to try and survive against the incredibly powerful forces of nature in space, or the gravitational forces and lack of oxygen, all those sorts of things. But it's kind of, as I say, man versus nature, or man or science versus nature, or something to that effect. But there is that opposition of her struggling to survive against that force. There are some that seem obvious but are actually quite nuanced if you really want to go into it. And those are the ones where you really can start to gain more marks if you manage to spot them. So I've used the Avengers as your example here. Now, the Avengers, very clearly, superhero movie, good versus evil. For those who can't remember or haven't seen the original Avengers movie, it eventually culminates in the superheroes teaming up and fighting against an alien invasion. So you've got man versus aliens, or the aliens' motivation is extinction, which is quite evil. So you could say good versus evil as well. However, the initial struggle of them coming together, actually a large part of the narrative is about the heroes uniting and forming a team. So you could argue that a large part of the narrative, in fact, the majority of the narrative, is division versus unity. The divided force struggling to unite. So there's those two forces there. Some of them want to be separate and struggle alone, whereas they are, some of them, such as Captain America, is fighting to unite them. And that actually is arguably the main narrative storyline. There is also the fact that some of these characters are more able than others. They are superheroes by definition. So you could have ability versus normality, or superhuman ability versus normal humanity, which is again another kind of almost polarizing opposite. And people like Iron Man, for example, and things like that struggle to hold on to that power throughout. So actually the Avengers, even though it is marketed towards family audience, even though the storyline at initial glimpse is very, very basic, actually there are many ways you could pull out binary opposites from the narrative. And as the narrative skips along, depending on what scene you look at, you could definitely find a variety of binary opposites as the narrative goes on. So your job is to look beyond the obvious. So those are three basic examples. The big question is, how do you apply this, whether it be in an exam or an essay or something to that? Essentially, look for the opposing forces in your chosen media text. That's the basics. That will get you your passing grade. If you can find good versus evil or the more nuanced oppositions in some of the narratives and highlight them, then you're halfway there. In order to really do very well, though, what you need to do is support your evidence of it. So if you are seeing, for example, good and evil in, as we saw earlier, Star Wars, what we'd then be doing in terms of the poster is looking at the connotations of color, looking at the positionings of the character, looking at facial expressions, looking at things that support your argument that Luke is clearly good and Darth Vader is clearly evil. In moving image extracts, you can be looking for different camera angles, different camera movement, different types of editing, sound, use of lighting and costume, all those things that help support your argument that what your binary opposites are, whether it be good or evil, man versus nature, or whatever you're arguing it is. The tools used to construct that media text are your evidence of the binary opposite that you are claiming.